Ever feel like economic news is speaking a whole other language? Like you're missing some secret decoder ring?
It can definitely feel that way sometime.
Right. You're not alone, though.
Mhm.
That's why for this deep dive, and it's one you all specifically asked for, we're tackling this head on. We're talking about how asking the right questions can completely change the game when it comes to understanding economics, even if you don't have a fancy degree in it.
Yeah, it's like having X-ray vision or something, you know? You can
Oh,
cut through all the jargon and the noise and get straight to the heart of what's actually going on.
totally. And our guide for this little adventure is this really thought-provoking piece. It's called Economics Confuses When You Don't Ask the Right Questions.
Catchy title.
Right. But don't worry, this isn't about to get all technical and equation heavy. It's really about approaching all that economic data we get bombarded with, with a healthy dose of curiosity and maybe a little side of, I don't know if I buy that. And who better to help us unpack all of this than our economics guru?
Happy to be here. Always love digging into this stuff.
Now, one of the things I found really interesting about this piece was the author's own background. They were very upfront about, not being some kind of economics whiz right out of the gate.
Oh yeah, they struggled with it at first.
Yeah, they did actually. And I think that's kind of refreshing to hear. It shows you don't need to have been born with some special economics gene to actually grasp this stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's something I try to emphasize all the time. People get intimidated because they think it's all formulas and graphs, right?
Mm,
But really at its core, it's about understanding the why behind the what, like any other field, really.
exactly. And for this author, the turning point was realizing it wasn't about raw smarts, but about asking the right questions. That's what they said, at least. They said that kind of relentless curiosity, it became the key for them to really unlock economics.
Which makes sense because if you think about it, well, actually, go on. I was going to jump in, but you were making a good
No,
point.
no, please go ahead.
I was going to say, that resonates so much with how I approach economics, too. It's not about memorizing a textbook. It's about asking, okay, but why is this happening? Or what does this really mean?
And get this, they're big on questioning everything, even, and maybe especially, expert opinions.
Well, especially those, right? I mean, how many times have we all seen those headlines? Experts predict economic boom one week, and then it's all doom and gloom the next.
Exactly. And that's kind of what makes this whole deep dive so important, I think. It's about giving everyone listening the tools to think critically about economic data, to not just be spoon-fed information, but to actually question it, dig a little deeper.
Because that's when you start seeing the full picture, I think. When you
Yeah.
start asking those questions, you see the nuances, the potential biases, and that's when economics becomes really empowering rather than just confusing or overwhelming.
So how does the author suggest we actually do that? They use a really interesting example talking about unemployment data in Barbados.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. See, the governor of the central bank was trying to explain why unemployment was rising, and they gave this really plausible explanation, like it made sense on the surface. But then the author, they go and challenge the accuracy of the data itself.
Wait, so not even just disagreeing with the interpretation of the data, but saying the data itself might be flawed.
Exactly. And that's a super important distinction to make because data isn't inherently true, right? It's collected in a certain way, it's interpreted through a certain lens, and all of those processes have limitations.
So the author is basically saying, hold on, just because a number is official doesn't mean it's telling the whole story.
Exactly. They were like, hold my drink and gotta work.
Okay, so walk us through this Barbados example a bit. What was it specifically about the unemployment data that wasn't sitting right with the author?
Well, they pointed out a few things. Like one thing they brought up was emigration. You've got a lot of young professionals, especially leaving the island to pursue opportunities elsewhere, right?
Right, so it's not just about people losing jobs within Barbados, but also about who's even counted in the workforce to begin with.
Exactly. It's like,
Mm.
imagine you're trying to measure, I don't know, how full a bathtub is, but you're only paying attention to how much water is coming out of the faucet
Sure.
and completely ignoring the fact that the drain is open.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right. So emigration is kind of like that open drain. In Barbados' case, it's got this whole other factor influencing those unemployment numbers.
Okay, so that's one factor they thought was maybe being overlooked. What else?
Early retirees. The data, it needs to take into account folks who are leaving the workforce earlier than expected, maybe. That wasn't really addressed in the initial interpretation of the data, at least not in the author's view. If you've got a bunch of people retiring early, that's going to affect the unemployment rate, but not necessarily in a way that reflects, a struggling economy.
So we're talking about these potential blind spots in how the data is collected, like what it actually captures versus what it might be missing.
Precisely. And then there's one more biggie the author brings up, which is how long-term unemployed individuals are classified. See, if someone's been out of work for an extended period, they might end up getting categorized as inactive instead of unemployed.
Ah, so they just kind of disappear from the unemployment statistic altogether.
In a way, yeah. They're no longer factored into that specific rate, even though they're obviously still without a job. And this is where it gets really crucial because that kind of shift in categorization, it can directly impact the overall unemployment rate. It might make things look rosier than they actually are, you know?
Wow, so you've got all these layers to consider.
Yeah.
Immigration, early retirement, this reclassification thing, all potentially skewing those unemployment numbers. And the author's saying the official data isn't really taking those into account fully enough.
Exactly. And without that full, accurate picture, policymakers might end up making decisions based on, well, faulty data. They
Yeah.
might underestimate the actual severity of unemployment and not implement the most effective measures to address the real issues at play. It's like trying to fix a leaky pipe when you're looking at the wrong section. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This is making me realize just how much critical thinking is baked into economics. Like, it's not just about taking numbers at face value. It's about understanding the context, the nuances, even what's not being said.
100%. And that's what this author is getting at. I think we've got to ask those uncomfortable questions, dig a little deeper, because the story behind the data is often way more complex than it seems at first glance.
So we've established that economic data can be, well, a little slippery sometimes. And what seems like a simple number on the surface can actually be hiding a whole lot of complexity underneath.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like one of those, what they call them, icebergs.
Right.
You only see the tip, but there's this whole massive thing going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. So for those of us who aren't, economics experts, what can we actually do about this? How can we be smarter consumers of economic news, especially when it comes to all this data?
That's the million-dollar question. And the good news is you don't need a PhD in economics to start cutting through the noise. This author's insights, I think, offer some really practical tools that anyone can use.
I'm all ears. What's the secret?
No secret, really.
Hmm.
It's more about shifting your mindset a bit.
Okay.
First and foremost, I'd say ditch the passive scrolling. Stop just accepting headlines at face value. If something catches your eye about the economy, take a beat. Ask yourself, where's this data coming from?
Okay, so source is important. Got it. What else?
Who's presenting it? Because let's be real, everyone's got an angle.
Oh, 100%.
And then this is a big one. What might their agenda be?
So a healthy dose of skepticism is key, basically. We've all seen how the same statistic can get spun in completely different directions depending on who's presenting it.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why my next tip would be don't limit yourself to just one source or even just one interpretation. Go out there and find analyses from different experts who might have varying viewpoints. See what they're saying.
It's like getting the full story instead of just one side of it.
Exactly. And then finally, and this might be the most powerful tool of all, ask yourself, what information is not being presented? Because sometimes what's left unsaid can be just as important as what is. Why might certain data points be missing? Are there alternative explanations that aren't being considered?
It's like in that Barbados example, just asking about immigration or early retirement added these whole other layers of understanding that weren't there in the initial presentation of the data.
Precisely. By actively engaging with economic news, by asking those critical questions, by considering different perspectives, you empower yourself to cut through the noise and form your own informed opinions. You're no longer just a passive recipient of whatever information is thrown at you, but an active participant in understanding these forces that are shaping all of our lives.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. It really drives home the point that economics isn't just about, crunching numbers in a vacuum. It's about critical thinking. It's about curiosity. It's about asking the right questions.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, sometimes the most uncomfortable questions lead to the most insightful answers.
So true. We hope you'll walk away from this deep dive feeling empowered, ready to question, to dig a little deeper, and to never stop seeking a deeper understanding of these economic forces that impact all of our lives. Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged.